The last time I saw my grandfather cry was at my grandmother's funeral. He stood at the edge of her grave, shoulders trembling beneath his worn brown suit, and I remember thinking that I had never seen a man look so completely broken. My grandmother Margaret had been the center of everything. She was the one who kept us all together, who remembered birthdays and organized holiday dinners and made sure that no matter how busy our lives became, we never forgot that we were family. When she died after a sudden stroke at 68 years old, something inside my grandfather seemed to collapse. I understood that. I felt it too. But I never imagined that her death would be the beginning of losing him as well. I never imagined that within 3 years, the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle and had walked me down the aisle at my father's absence during my college graduation ceremony would become a stranger. I never imagined that he would choose someone else over his own bloodline, and I certainly never imagined that I would have to fight to expose the woman who stole him from us piece by piece until there was nothing left of the grandfather I had known. My name is Emily Carter, and this is the story of how I lost my grandfather to a woman who saw him not as a person to love, but as a prize to win. This is the story of how I watched my family fall apart, how I was painted as the villain in a narrative I never wrote, and how I eventually found the strength to uncover the truth, even when the truth was more painful than the lies. My grandparents had been married for 47 years when my grandmother passed away. They had met in 1975 at a church social in a small town in Ohio. And according to family legend, my grandfather had known within 5 minutes of meeting her that she was the woman he was going to marry. He was a contractor back then, young and ambitious, with calloused hands and a smile that could light up a room. She was a school teacher, soft-spoken but fiercely intelligent, with a laugh that made everyone around her feel at ease. They built a life together in the truest sense of the word. My grandfather literally built their house with his own hands, a beautiful 2-story colonial on 3 acres of land that became the gathering place for every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday dinner for as long as I could remember. I grew up in that house in a way that most grandchildren don't. My parents lived just 10 minutes away, and because my mother worked long shifts as a nurse and my father ran his own landscaping business, my brother Michael and I spent more time with our grandparents than most kids spent with their own parents. My grandmother taught me to read using her old collection of children's books. My grandfather taught me to fish in the pond behind their property and to appreciate the satisfaction of working with your hands. They were not just grandparents to me, they were second parents, anchors, the foundation upon which my understanding of love and family was built. When my grandmother died, the funeral was enormous. People came from 3 different states to pay their respects. Former students she had taught decades ago showed up with flowers and tear-streaked faces. Neighbors who had known her for 40 years stood in line for over an hour just to hug my grandfather and tell him how sorry they were. I remember standing next to him at the reception afterward, watching him shake hands and accept condolences with a grace that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. But I also remember the way his hand trembled when he reached for his glass of water. I remember the way his eyes kept drifting to the empty chair where she would have sat. I remember thinking that this was going to be the hardest chapter of his life and that we, his family, would need to be there for him in ways we had never been there before. For the first 6 months after her death, that's exactly what we did. My father went over to the house every single day to check on him. My mother cooked meals and brought them over in carefully labeled containers. My brother Michael handled the finances, making sure bills were paid and accounts were in order. I called every evening, sometimes just to talk about nothing, sometimes to sit in comfortable silence while he watched the news. My cousin Jessica, who had been particularly close to my grandmother, drove down from her university every other weekend just to spend time with him. We were determined to make sure he knew he wasn't alone. We were determined to help him through his grief, and for a while, it seemed like it was working. By the 1-year anniversary of my grandmother's death, my grandfather had started to emerge from the fog. He was attending church again. He had rejoined his weekly poker game with his old friends. He even started talking about fixing up the garden, which had fallen into neglect during the worst of his mourning. We celebrated these small victories as a family, believing that the worst was behind us, that he was healing, that life would eventually find a new kind of normal. Then Veronica Shaw appeared. I first heard her name about 14 months after my grandmother's funeral. My grandfather mentioned her casually during one of our evening phone calls, describing her as a nice woman from the church who had been helping him organize some of my grandmother's old belongings. I didn't think much of it at the time. Churches are full of kind people who volunteer their time to help the grieving, and my grandfather had always been well-liked in the community. It seemed natural that someone would offer to help him with the difficult task of sorting through decades of accumulated memories. But then her name kept coming up. Veronica had stopped by with a casserole. Veronica had helped him clean out the garage. Veronica had driven him to his doctor's appointment because he didn't feel like driving himself. Each mention was delivered with the same casual tone, but something about the frequency began to bother me. I mentioned it to my mother during a Sunday dinner, and she waved it off with a smile. She said it was good that someone was looking out for him, that he needed companionship, that we couldn't be there every moment of every day. My father agreed. My brother, ever the pragmatist, pointed out that having someone to help with practical tasks took some of the burden off the rest of us. Only my cousin Jessica shared my unease, though neither of us could articulate exactly why. 3 months later, my grandfather announced that he was dating Veronica. I remember the phone call with perfect clarity. It was a Thursday evening in April, and I was sitting on my apartment balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My grandfather's voice was nervous, almost shy, like a teenager confessing a crush. He told me that Veronica had become very special to him, that she made him feel less alone, that he hoped I would be happy for him. I forced enthusiasm into my voice, told him that of course I was happy, that he deserved to find joy again after everything he had been through. When I hung up the phone, I sat there for a long time, trying to understand the cold knot of dread that had formed in my stomach. I met Veronica for the first time 2 weeks later. My grandfather had invited the whole family over for dinner, and she was there when we arrived, already moving through my grandmother's kitchen like she owned it. She was younger than I had expected, somewhere in her early 40s, with bottle blonde hair and a smile that seemed to stretch just a little too wide. She was attractive in a polished, deliberate way, the kind of woman who clearly spent a lot of time and money on her appearance. She greeted each of us with hugs that lasted a beat too long and compliments that felt rehearsed. She told my father that she could see where my grandfather got his good looks. She told my mother that she had heard so much about her and couldn't wait to become friends. She told me that I was even prettier than my grandfather had described and that she hoped we would become close. Everything about her felt wrong to me. It wasn't just the age difference, though, that was certainly part of it. Veronica was 31 years younger than my grandfather, young enough to be his daughter, and the optics of the relationship made me deeply uncomfortable. But it was more than that. There was something calculating in her eyes, something that watched and measured even as her mouth formed friendly words. I noticed the way she touched my grandfather constantly, her hand on his arm, her fingers brushing his shoulder, always maintaining physical contact as if staking a claim. I noticed the way she steered conversations away from my grandmother, subtly changing the subject whenever anyone mentioned her name. I noticed the way she positioned herself between my grandfather and the rest of us, literally inserting her body into the space between him and his family. After dinner, I pulled my father aside and told him what I had observed. He listened with a furrowed brow, then sighed and told me I was being overprotective. He said my grandfather was a grown man who had the right to make his own choices. He said that just because Veronica was younger didn't mean her feelings weren't genuine. He reminded me that my grandfather had been desperately lonely and that if this woman made him happy, we should support him. I wanted to argue, wanted to lay out all the small details that had set off alarm bells in my mind, but I could see in his eyes that his mind was already made up. He wanted to believe the best about the situation. We all did. The engagement was announced 4 months later. My grandfather gathered us all at the house on a Sunday afternoon, and Veronica stood beside him with a diamond ring glittering on her finger. The stone was enormous, far larger than the modest ring my grandmother had worn for nearly 5 decades, and I couldn't help but wonder how much it had cost. My grandfather was beaming, happier than I had seen him since my grandmother's death, and that happiness made it impossible to voice the objections that were screaming inside my head. Instead, I hugged him and told him congratulations. I hugged Veronica and wished her well. And then I went home and cried until my eyes were swollen shut. The wedding took place 3 months after the engagement, a small ceremony at the church where my grandparents had been married, where my grandmother's funeral had been held. Veronica wore white despite her 2 previous divorces, and she walked down the aisle with the confident stride of a woman who had won a prize. I sat in the front row next to my parents and watched my grandfather exchange vows with a woman he had known for less than 2 years, and I felt something inside me start to break. It wasn't just grief, though grief was certainly part of it. It was the growing certainty that something terrible was happening, that this woman was not who she pretended to be, and that my grandfather was walking into a trap he couldn't see. The changes started slowly, so slowly that it took months for us to realize what was happening. At first, it was little things. My grandfather stopped answering his phone as often. When we did reach him, Veronica was always there, always listening, always chiming in with comments that steered the conversation away from anything substantive. Sunday dinners at the house became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Veronica claimed that the large gatherings were too exhausting for my grandfather, that he needed rest, that she was trying to protect his health. When my father suggested smaller visits, just him and my mother, Veronica said that the house was being renovated and it wasn't a good time. The renovations seemed to go on forever. Then came the holidays. For as long as I could remember, Christmas had been celebrated at my grandparents' house. It was the one immutable tradition in our family, the gathering that everyone organized their schedules around, the day when 3 generations came together to exchange gifts and share a meal and remember what it meant to be connected by blood. The first Christmas after the wedding, we received a carefully worded email from Veronica explaining that she and my grandfather would be spending the holiday in Florida at a resort she had booked. She said the Ohio winters were too hard on his joints. She said they would call on Christmas Day to wish everyone well. The call never came. That was the year I started keeping a record. I didn't call it evidence at the time. I called it observations, concerns, things I wanted to remember so I could bring them up with my grandfather when I finally had a chance to speak with him alone. I wrote down every canceled visit, every unanswered phone call, every excuse that Veronica offered for why we couldn't see him. I noted the way my father's weekly visits had dwindled to monthly, then bi-monthly, then stopped altogether because Veronica always had a reason why it wasn't convenient. I documented the moment when my grandfather's old phone number was disconnected and replaced with a new one that Veronica controlled. I saved the text messages where Veronica responded on his behalf, always polite, but always deflecting, always creating distance. By the 2nd year of the marriage, we were barely part of my grandfather's life. The house where I had grown up, the house my grandfather had built with his own hands, had been transformed. My grandmother's garden was gone, replaced with a stark, modern landscape that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her furniture had been sold or thrown away, replaced with sleek, contemporary pieces that felt cold and unfamiliar. Her photographs had been taken down from the walls. When I finally managed to visit after months of trying, I walked through rooms I no longer recognized and felt like a stranger in my own history. My grandfather seemed different too. He was thinner than I remembered, and there was a vagueness to his eyes that worried me. He still smiled when he saw me, still hugged me like he meant it, but there was something missing, some essential spark that had been dimmed. When I tried to talk to him about the family, about how we missed him, about how we wanted to spend more time with him, He glanced at Veronica before answering. Every response felt filtered, rehearsed, like he was reciting lines someone else had written. Before I left that day, I asked if I could speak with him privately for a few minutes. Veronica's smile flickered just for an instant before she recovered and said, of course, she would just be in the kitchen if anyone needed her. But she didn't go to the kitchen. She hovered in the hallway, close enough to hear everything, and my grandfather kept looking toward the door as if he expected her to walk in at any moment. I asked him if he was happy. He said yes. I asked if Veronica was treating him well. He said yes. I asked if he knew how much we all missed him. His eyes watered, and for just a second, I saw something that looked like fear. Then Veronica called from the hallway that she had made tea, and the moment was gone. That night, I called my brother and told him everything I had observed. Michael, who had always been the skeptic of the family, had undergone his own transformation over the previous months. He had been trying to help my grandfather with his finances, a role he had assumed after my grandmother's death, but Veronica had slowly pushed him out. She had convinced my grandfather to change banks, to hire a new accountant, to take Michael's name off the accounts where it had been added for emergency access. When Michael had questioned these changes, Veronica had called him controlling and paranoid. My grandfather, who had trusted Michael implicitly for years, had sided with his new wife. But Michael had seen enough before losing access to know that something was very wrong. In the year since the wedding, my grandfather had spent an extraordinary amount of money. There were charges for jewelry, for designer clothing, for luxury travel, for home renovations that seemed far more extensive than necessary. There was a new car for Veronica, a Mercedes convertible that cost more than my annual salary. There were transfers to an account that Michael didn't recognize, regular payments that looked almost like a salary being paid to someone. When Michael had tried to ask about these expenditures, he had been shut out entirely. We decided that night that we needed to take action. We couldn't force my grandfather to leave Veronica, and we couldn't prove that she was doing anything illegal, but we could try to make him see what was happening. We planned an intervention of sorts, a family meeting where we would lay out our concerns calmly and lovingly and give him the chance to respond. We spent weeks preparing, gathering our observations, practicing how to present them without sounding accusatory. We wanted him to know that we loved him, that we weren't trying to control his life, that we just wanted to make sure he was safe and happy. The intervention never happened. Before we could arrange it, we received a letter from an attorney. The letter informed us that Harold Carter was requesting that we cease all contact with him and his wife. It stated that our behavior had been harassing and intrusive, and that any further attempts to communicate would be met with legal action. It instructed us not to call, not to visit, not to send letters or emails or messages of any kind. It was signed by a law firm I had never heard of, but when I researched them later, I discovered that they specialized in elder law and family disputes. The letter was written in cold, formal language, but the message was clear. We had been cut off. My father broke down when he read that letter. I had never seen him cry before, not even at my grandmother's funeral, but that night he sat at our kitchen table with tears streaming down his face and asked what he had done wrong. My mother held him and tried to offer comfort, but her own eyes were red from crying. Michael was furious, pacing back and forth and swearing that he would find a way to prove that Veronica was behind this. And I sat there in silence, feeling the last pieces of my hope crumble to dust. We tried everything we could think of to reach him. We sent letters that were returned unopened. We drove to the house and found the gates locked, a new security system installed that we didn't have the code for. We reached out to his old friends, but one by one, they reported that they had also been cut off, told by Veronica that Harold was unwell and needed to rest. We contacted Adult Protective Services, but our report went nowhere. A social worker visited the house and found a competent elderly man who denied any abuse or coercion. Veronica had apparently been charming and cooperative, and my grandfather had told them, in his own words, that he didn't want contact with his family. There was nothing they could do. 6 months passed in this awful limbo. We existed in a state of constant grief, mourning a man who was still alive but completely unreachable. I threw myself into work, into routines, into anything that could distract me from the gaping hole where my grandfather had been. But I never stopped watching. I never stopped gathering information. I checked public records obsessively, looking for any sign of what was happening inside that house. I monitored social media accounts, though Veronica rarely posted and my grandfather had never had one. I talked to anyone who might have had contact with them, building a picture piece by piece of a life that had been completely transformed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My cousin Jessica, who had been devastated by the estrangement, had a friend who worked at the county recorder's office. Through this friend, Jessica learned that a significant change had been made to my grandfather's property deed. The house, the land, everything he had built over 50 years had been transferred into Veronica's name. The transfer had occurred just 3 months after the wedding, while my grandfather was still alive and presumably competent. On paper, it looked legal. In reality, it felt like theft. That discovery set off a chain reaction of investigation that would consume the next year of my life. Armed with the knowledge that Veronica was systematically transferring my grandfather's assets into her own name, we hired a private investigator to dig into her background. What he found was damning. Veronica Shaw had been married twice before, both times to older men, both times ending in divorce after she had extracted significant financial assets. Her first husband, a retired doctor in Arizona, had divorced her after discovering that she had forged his signature on several financial documents. The case had been settled out of court, with Veronica walking away with a substantial sum in exchange for the charges being dropped. Her second husband, a businessman in Texas, had died of a heart attack while they were still married. His children had contested the will, claiming that Veronica had unduly influenced their father during his final years, but they had lost the case after a lengthy court battle. Veronica had inherited nearly $2 million. The pattern was unmistakable. Veronica was a predator who targeted vulnerable older men, cultivated their trust, isolated them from their families, and transferred their wealth into her own name. She was careful and methodical, never doing anything that could be easily proven as illegal, always staying just within the boundaries of the law. She had done it before, and now she was doing it to my grandfather. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things. My grandfather was still legally competent, and he had the right to make his own decisions about his property and his relationships. The fact that those decisions were being influenced by a manipulative woman who had done the same thing before wasn't, in itself, evidence of a crime. We needed more. We needed proof that Veronica was actually exploiting him, that she was using undue influence or outright fraud to control his finances. The proof came from the most unlikely place imaginable. Remember the restraining order that Veronica had threatened in that first letter? A few months after the property transfer, she actually filed one. She went to court and claimed that I had been stalking her, that I had been sending threatening messages, that I had shown up at her home and made her fear for her safety. None of it was true. I had not contacted her or my grandfather in any way since receiving that cease and desist letter. But she had created fake evidence, fabricated text messages that looked like they came from my phone number, invented incidents that had never happened, and presented them to a judge as proof of harassment. The hearing was one of the worst experiences of my life. I sat in a courtroom and listened to Veronica describe, with convincing tears and a trembling voice, how terrified she was of me. She talked about the threatening messages. She talked about the time I had followed her to the grocery store. She talked about my unstable behavior, my obsession with her, my refusal to accept that my grandfather had chosen her over his family. The judge looked at me with suspicion and disapproval, and I realized with sick certainty that she was winning. But Veronica had made a mistake. In her fabricated text messages, she had included specific dates and times when I had supposedly sent threatening content. What she didn't know was that I had alibis for several of those dates, solid, provable alibis that placed me hundreds of miles away at the time the messages were allegedly sent. On one of the dates she claimed I had followed her to the grocery store, I had been at a work conference in Chicago with dozens of witnesses and time-stamped photographs and hotel receipts and flight records. Her lies were verifiable lies, and I could prove it. My attorney presented this evidence at the hearing, and I watched Veronica's face change as she realized what was happening. The judge, who had seemed so sympathetic to her moments before, now looked at her with very different eyes. The restraining order was denied, and the judge made a pointed comment about the seriousness of filing false claims with the court. But more importantly, Veronica's attempt to silence me had backfired spectacularly. By fabricating evidence and perjuring herself in court, she had given us exactly what we needed. She had shown her true character to someone with the power to do something about it. I filed a defamation lawsuit against Veronica the following week. I also reported her to the police for filing a false report and perjury, and I reached out to the adult children of her second husband, the ones who had lost their inheritance case against her years before, and shared everything I had learned. They were more than willing to help. They had suspected for years that their father's death had been suspicious, that Veronica had somehow hastened it, but they had never been able to prove anything. Now, with evidence of a pattern of behavior stretching across 3 marriages and multiple states, we finally had enough to get people to listen. The next few months were a flurry of legal activity. The police investigation into Veronica's perjury led to a broader investigation into her financial dealings with my grandfather. Forensic accountants examined the transfers and discovered irregularities that suggested my grandfather's signatures had been forged on several documents. Medical records were subpoenaed and revealed that my grandfather had been prescribed a cocktail of medications, some of which were known to cause confusion and impaired judgment, by a doctor who turned out to be a close personal friend of Veronica's. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and the picture they formed was damning. But the most important moment came when we finally got my grandfather alone. The police, as part of their investigation, needed to interview him without Veronica present. They arranged for her to be called to the station for questioning about the perjury charges, and while she was gone, a social worker and 2 detectives arrived at the house to speak with my grandfather. My father and I were allowed to be there, standing in the background, while professionals asked careful questions designed to assess his mental state and understanding of his situation. What emerged from that interview broke my heart and saved my family at the same time. My grandfather, freed for the first time in years from Veronica's constant supervision, began to cry. He said he hadn't understood what was happening. He said Veronica had told him that we didn't want to see him anymore, that we had abandoned him, that the only person who truly loved him was her. He said she had monitored his phone calls, intercepted his mail, told him that the medications he was taking were necessary for his health even when they made him feel foggy and confused. He said he had been afraid to question her because she had made him believe he had no one else. He said he had signed documents without reading them because she told him they were routine and he trusted her. He looked at my father with eyes full of pain and confusion and asked why we had stopped coming to see him. My father couldn't speak. He just crossed the room and held his father while both of them sobbed. And I stood there watching, feeling simultaneously relieved and enraged, grateful that we had finally broken through but furious at everything that had been stolen from us. Veronica was arrested 3 days later. The charges included financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, perjury, and filing false police reports. Her fancy attorney negotiated aggressively, but the evidence was overwhelming. She had been careless in her confidence, had left paper trails she should have destroyed, had trusted that my grandfather's isolation would protect her indefinitely. The forensic accountants discovered that she had transferred over $900,000 from my grandfather's accounts into her own name over the course of the marriage. She had sold family heirlooms, including my grandmother's jewelry, and pocketed the proceeds. She had taken out a second mortgage on the house in my grandfather's name and used the money to fund her lifestyle. The trial took 6 months. I was there for every day of it, watching as witness after witness testified to Veronica's pattern of predatory behavior. Her first husband flew in from Arizona to describe how she had forged his signature and manipulated his finances. The adult children of her second husband testified about the suspicious circumstances of their father's death and the fortune that had disappeared into Veronica's accounts. Financial experts laid out the systematic looting of my grandfather's life savings. Medical experts testified that the medications she had convinced him to take were unnecessary and likely intended to keep him compliant. Veronica took the stand in her own defense and tried to play the victim. She cried and claimed that she had truly loved my grandfather, that everything she had done was out of devotion to him, that his family had been jealous and controlling and had tried to turn him against her from the beginning, but by that point, no one believed her. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. She was sentenced to 12 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution. But here is the part of the story that still keeps me awake at night. Here is the part that doesn't have a neat, satisfying conclusion. My grandfather never fully recovered. The medications Veronica had kept him on for years had done real damage to his cognitive function. The isolation, the manipulation, the psychological abuse of being told his family had abandoned him, all of it had left scars that couldn't be erased by legal victory. In the months after Veronica's arrest, we worked to rebuild our relationship with him, to spend time at the house, to help him understand what had happened. But there were days when he didn't recognize me. There were days when he asked where Margaret was and couldn't understand when we told him she had died. There were days when he looked at us with confusion and suspicion, still not quite believing that we hadn't abandoned him. The house, which we had hoped to save, ultimately had to be sold to pay for his care. The second mortgage Veronica had taken out, combined with the depletion of his savings, meant that even with restitution, there wasn't enough to maintain the property. I was there on the day the new owners took possession, watching strangers walk through the rooms where my grandmother had raised her children and where I had spent the happiest days of my childhood. My father couldn't bear to be there. He said goodbye to the house in his own way, alone, before anyone else arrived. My grandfather lives in a memory care facility now. It's a good one, clean and well-staffed, and we visit as often as we can. Some days he knows exactly who we are, and we talk for hours about the old times, about my grandmother, about the life they built together before Veronica ever appeared. Other days he thinks I'm my mother, or he doesn't recognize me at all, and I just sit with him and hold his hand and tell him that he's loved. The cruelest irony is that he sometimes asks about Veronica, asks where she went, doesn't remember that she was the one who nearly destroyed him. We don't tell him. What would be the point? I used to think that justice would feel like victory. I used to imagine that when Veronica was finally held accountable, when the truth was finally exposed, I would feel something like triumph. But the truth is more complicated than that. Yes, she's in prison. Yes, she paid for what she did. Yes, my grandfather knows now that we never abandoned him. But so much was lost that can never be recovered. Time that was stolen from us. Money that was supposed to provide for his final years. His health, his clarity, the chance to spend his last good years surrounded by the family that loved him instead of isolated by a woman who saw him as a source of income. What I feel now isn't triumph. It's something more like exhausted grief. But I also feel something else. Something I didn't expect. I feel strong. I feel proud. I spent years fighting for the truth when everyone around me told me I was being paranoid, that I should let it go, that my grandfather had the right to make his own choices. I kept documenting, kept investigating, kept pushing even when it seemed hopeless. And because of that persistence, Veronica didn't win. She didn't get away with it. She didn't walk off into the sunset with my grandfather's money while he died alone and confused. He knows the truth now. He knows we never stopped loving him. And even on the days when he doesn't remember my name, I can look into his eyes and know that somewhere deep inside, he feels safe again. That has to be enough. It has to be enough because it's all I have. If you're watching this and you recognize any part of this story, if someone you love is being slowly isolated by a new partner who seems too good to be true, please don't wait as long as I did. Document everything. Talk to a lawyer, contact Adult Protective Services. Don't assume that just because nothing seems illegal, nothing is wrong. Predators like Veronica are experts at staying just inside the law while they systematically destroy lives. They count on families giving up, on people being too polite to make accusations, on the legal system moving too slowly to stop them. Don't be polite. Don't give up. Fight for the people you love, even when they can't fight for themselves. My grandfather was a good man who spent his life building things, a home, a family, a community that respected him. He didn't deserve what happened to him. None of the people Veronica targeted deserved what happened to them, but she's paying for it now. She's sitting in a prison cell while my grandfather sits in a sunny room surrounded by photographs of the people who love him. That's not a perfect ending. It's not the ending I wanted, but it's the ending we fought for, and I will never regret a single moment of that fight. Some nights, when I visit my grandfather and he's having a clear day, he holds my hand and tells me about my grandmother. He talks about how they met, how he knew right away she was the one, how he still misses her every single day. He doesn't mention Veronica at all. It's like those years have been erased from his memory, replaced by an earlier, happier time. Maybe that's a mercy. Maybe his mind is protecting him from the worst of what happened. Or maybe, somewhere deep inside, he always knew. Maybe part of him was fighting all along, waiting for us to find him, trusting that we would never give up. The last time I visited, as I was leaving, he looked up at me with perfect clarity and said something that stopped me in my tracks. He said, "I'm sorry I made you wait so long." I knelt down beside his chair and told him there was nothing to be sorry for. I told him we would have waited forever. I told him that family doesn't give up on each other, no matter how hard the fight. He smiled then, a real smile, the kind I remembered from my childhood. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," he said. "She always said you were the stubborn one." I laughed and cried at the same time, holding his hand tight. "I learned it from watching you both," I told him. "You taught me what it means to fight for the things that matter." He nodded, his eyes drifting toward the window, toward the sunlight streaming in. "That's good," he said softly. "That's real good." We sat there together in comfortable silence, and for just a moment, everything felt almost whole again. The story I've told you doesn't have a happy ending, not really. Too much was lost for that. But it has a true ending, an honest ending, the kind of ending that comes when you refuse to let lies win. Veronica thought she could take everything from us. She thought she could erase us from my grandfather's life and rewrite his story with herself at the center, but she underestimated the bonds that connect families, the love that survives even when it's tested, the stubborn determination of people who refuse to let go. My grandmother used to say that the truth always comes out eventually. She used to say that you can't build anything lasting on a foundation of lies. That deception always crumbles in the end. I used to think those were just things people said, comfortable cliches that helped them sleep at night. Now I know she was right. The truth came out. The lies crumbled. And even though the damage can never be fully undone, even though my grandfather will never fully recover, even though we lost years that we can never get back, we still won. We won because we didn't give up. We won because we kept fighting. We won because, in the end, love is stronger than manipulation, and truth is stronger than lies. That's the lesson I take from everything that happened. That's what I want anyone watching this to understand. You are stronger than you think. The people you love are worth fighting for. And no matter how powerful the person working against you seems, no matter how hopeless the situation looks, there is always a way to shine light into the darkness. My grandfather chose his new wife over his own bloodline. For 3 terrible years, we lost him to a woman who saw him as nothing more than a source of income. But in the end, we got him back. Not completely. Not in the way I would have wanted. But enough. Enough to hold his hand on clear days and remember the man he used to be. Enough to tell him we love him and know that he hears it. Enough to sit with him in the sunshine and feel, if only for a moment, like a family again. Veronica is in prison, and my grandfather is safe, and the truth has finally been told. That's not a fairy tale ending, but it's a real one. And sometimes, real is enough.